Hello, everyone, and welcome to Kalorama's Strategic Brief webinar, Global Trends and Growth Opportunities in the IVD Market. Thank you, everyone who has joined us today. Before we get started, I'm going to give us just a few minutes as we wait for final registrants to join us. All right, I see some more people joining us, so I am going to get things started. We will take just a minute to go through some housekeeping items, and then we'll kick off. Again, thank you everyone who's joined us today for Kalorama's Strategic Brief webinar, Global Trends and Growth Opportunities in the IVD Market. I'm Elisa Alvick, Science and Medicine Group Marketing Director. I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. And again, we'll go through a few housekeeping items before we kick off. First, if you experience any issues throughout the broadcast, feel free to put them in the chat right at the bottom of your screen. I'll work with you directly to fix them. Second, this presentation will be available on demand after the webinar is concluded. An email will be sent to you with information on how to access the recording and the presentation. Third, we will be taking time at the end for some question and answers. Feel free to submit your questions at any time throughout the presentation. We'll get to as many of those as possible. If we don't get to your questions, we'll be sure to follow up with you after the webinar. All right, we've got a great crowd. Without further ado, I'm excited to hand it over to today's host, Bruce Carlson, head of Kalorama Information. Bruce, thanks for joining us. When you're ready, please take it away.
Thank you, Lisa. Much appreciated. Thanks, everyone, for being here on the webinar. This is our strategic briefing on the IVD market. I should note that it's entirely based on information from the 18th edition, 18th, a lot of editions, 2 decades that Kalorama has been publishing this report. Very proud to be part of it this year. And of course, the webinar is just going to be a small slice of this huge volume, over 1,000 pages, lots of estimates, forecast, revenue results, segments and sub-segment reporting areas. We're just going to get into a little bit. So be sure to secure a copy of this report for your organization if you're not one of the many IVD companies that do have it already. Before we start talking about numbers, let's talk about trends. These are the foundations of the in vitro diagnostics market that inform our numbers. These are the things going on today. And you start with age and population trends. The world is aging, and the world is aging faster. Indeed, people who are age 65 or greater, that category is expected to grow by 110% between 2022 and 2050, while the rest of the world population just grows at 54%. What does that mean? Aging means more potential for healthcare interventions, more hospitalizations. And it's true that in current society, people are exercising more and things like that. And that goes a little against it, but generally more hospitalization, more testing, more surgeries, more testing. That's a positive trend for the in vitro diagnostics market. At the same time, we've got our in vitro diagnostic customers. The laboratories are suffering a bit, having trouble staffing their labs. That's something that in vitro diagnostic manufacturers need to deal with. Point of care and point of need. This has long been a trend. You're seeing centralization of labs, but also decentralization. Been talking about that for a decade. But for the first time, really, that I've seen, Kalorama's noticed, point of care is challenged a bit. And the challenge partly comes from home collection, home testing, but also just from the kind of inertia of healthcare systems, maybe not wanting to use point of care systems. We'll get a little bit more into that as we go along. So it's going to be outside of some areas we'll talk about. Point of care has some challenges. It's still, though, a great place for companies to get into the in vitro diagnostics market. Now, all of these great tests that our industry makes, governments don't always want to pay for it. So cost containment schemes, you're seeing the big, beautiful bill in the US, which had a Medicaid cut provision. You're also seeing the potential for PAMA revision. Maybe you get a good result like the results bill. Maybe we don't. So we'll see. Other countries have the same ideas. It's not like China or the UK don't have their own type of programs. And then you're seeing our customers consolidating, lab customers consolidating, and even IVD consolidating a bit. These are the trends that inform these numbers. But there's one big trend that I need to talk about here, and that's that overall, the value of in vitro diagnostics, of clinical testing, is undersold. That's just objectively the case. IVDs are used in 70% of medical decisions. There's even that used to be something that was just thrown around, and now there's studies to support it. Recent YouGov survey conducted by Siemens Healthineers, by the way, 98% of physicians said they had altered a treatment based on a test result. And yet, what does this industry receive? Lab testing accounts for just 2% of total healthcare spending, at least in the US, often flat reimbursement rates outside of advanced tests, and always the sword of Damocles hanging over the industry's head of PAMA and other cuts always seem to be subject to future cuts. As a friend of ours has said, when is the member of Congress going to get up and say labs need to receive more funding? That just doesn't happen yet. Why do I bring this up? It's a key trend over everything, and it puts a kind of ceiling on the IVD market. However, let's talk about that market from our 18th edition. The in vitro diagnostics market is $113 billion, and we project that it will rise by 5% CAGR to $142 billion in 2030. This is higher growth than we forecasted in our 2024 edition last year by about 1% CAGR. The reason are all those trends we talked about before, but particularly that aging of the population showing up in developed countries. Now, when you see 5%, you say, Bruce, that can't possibly be my test category that I'm the product manager of isn't growing 5%. And this is true. Some will grow lower than the market. Some will go higher. Let's talk about lower. Hematology, chemistry, slightly lower. Chemistry is actually up a bit in growth, but it's slightly lower than this 5%. Another category that might surprise you is point of care that is not infectious disease. We used to see terrific growth rates from this, sometimes double digits, over Kalorama's history of reporting on in vitro diagnostics over 2 decades. Then you saw it go to like the high single digits, and now I would put it in low single digit in a low single digit category. These are point of care tests that aren't for an infectious disease purpose. You also see blood bank, coagulation, urinalysis, and chemistry and hematology, again, lower than that 5%. What's higher than that 5%? Point of care infectious disease. You're going to see that about 2 or 3 points higher than market. Genetic and inherited disease, very popular added categories of testing, even though even they are under pressure from payers. What else? Immunohistochemistry, in situ hybridization, novel proteins, particularly for Alzheimer's testing, neurological conditions, and pathology. They're growing faster than the rest of the market. What's the market made of? Now, in our report, we're going to break out every major segment and a lot of subsegments. I mean, on nearly 100 segments reported total and a lot of variations within those. But the one that we'll talk about here is the amount of this market that's infectious disease driven. When you look at blood bank testing, when you look at point of care infectious disease, tests for respiratory conditions, tests for hepatitis, HIV, all of that. A lot of IVD is infectious disease. Emerging threats are occurring, will occur, have occurred. The largest injection of cash, obviously, in this market came as a result of a respiratory condition. There could be future epidemics, maybe not as severe, maybe not to the pandemic level. But you're seeing about 30 to 40% of this market is infectious disease related. And a lot of companies that are in that sector are going to be among those growing faster. Where is this revenue being earned? It's not all the United States, but the United States is the largest market. We project that to be 41% of this 113 billion, where outside the United States is 59% of that 113 billion. The top growing geographies, what a difference 5 years makes. But let's talk about where the fastest growing countries are for IVD markets. And by the way, our report is going to break out all of these countries, what their growth rates are. If you subscribe to Kalorama's subscription, which I think is a great value, you get on a regular basis these atlases of 30 countries where we go into great detail on all of these country markets. So, but just looking at some country names that are the top growers: China, Poland, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, but also the US, Germany, France, UK, and Brazil, not as surprising. That's always been a fast grower. Now, if I went further down this chart, we'd have the Netherlands and Switzerland in these top growth areas. Now, this is very different from 5 years ago. 5 years ago, you would have been talking about China, South Korea, Singapore, Peru, Brazil again, the Philippines, India, countries that we expect to be fast growers. Now it's the developed countries that are actually showing rates of growth either at that market level or higher. Why? It's that aging population. I mean, there's other factors. They're also very well-funded healthcare systems, and they can afford some of the higher price type of testings and instruments and make automation improvements. But it's really that age. We've been talking about age at Kalorama for 2 decades. I know I've been here for some of them. It's starting to happen. It's starting to happen in the financials, where you're actually just seeing core areas like chemistry and hematology grow. Now, who's earning this revenue? This is the major IVD vendors. Abbott Diagnostics leads, Roche is second. The reason Abbott Diagnostic leads is, of course, based on its strength in glucose and its strength in point of care. Roche is a close second. If you took out glucose, it would probably be number one. It's very strong in molecular and strong in the core lab. It will continue to be strong, and it has a lot of testing that's well tied to its adjacent pharma business as well. And you're seeing a lot of plans. We'll talk about Roche in a bit. Let's talk about some individual vendors and what's going on with them as we move along here. So you may have heard the news that Becton Dickinson had sold its IVD, or will be part of Waters Corporation. That includes life science and diagnostics. So Waters is entering the IVD market. Mindray, watch them. I mean, there was a time long ago when they, in our reports, they were not on this chart. It's grown as an overall company 5 times in revenue since 2014. Recent and very popular hematology systems. They won ADLM's award for a long troponin test. Quidel, I note that they purchased Lex Diagnostics, so they are moving away from their Savannah model and using Lex as their molecular POC strategy. So watch for them to come on the scene with that new entity. Siemens, it looks like, according to media reports, talked to venture capitalists about a sale of its IVD division. I think there's a lot of activity right now in IVD, and you're seeing some people get in, some people get out. The bad news would be if there are no buyers. As long as there's buyers, that's good for the IVD market. And again, that's only according to media reports, so we really don't know. Also note that Roche announced earlier in the year that they would like to fix the issue between they and Abbott, let's say. They didn't say it that way, but they're going to address point of care in a big way that has been Abbott's strength and make it a priority. They also plan to launch a sequencer next year. And so that's going to be a pretty exciting thing for oncology, for rare disease, and we're going to see how that all shakes out. So if both those moves are made, they're taking on Abbott and taking on Illumina at the same time. Going to be an interesting market to watch in 2016. With that, I do have a few more slides, but I just figured this is a great time to take questions if we have any questions. We got a lot of folks on the webinar, so please let me know if you've got any questions for me.
Awesome. Thanks, Bruce. It looks like, and again, everyone, you are welcome to submit your questions in the Q&A section at any point. You know what? I do have one question, and then we can finish up your slides. And again, at any point, anyone can submit their questions. We've got, what do you think the impact of the recent court decision on LTDs on IVD, if any?
Yeah, so good question, and one that's on everyone's mind. You're probably seeing several news stories over LTDs, even though the court decision was a while ago, where essentially the federal judge threw out the FDA's rule that they announced last year that they would treat lab-developed tests the same as an IVD device. So a test that's conducted in a lab, maybe for a rare disease or a type of pediatric cancer, say, they're going to treat that as if it were a box and regulate it and make the lab do those things. And what you've seen is that the court did not agree with that interpretation, that the FDA's regulatory power includes that. But you're also seeing some evidence of the FDA, say, writing warning letters to various companies that might be using a research use only test and marketing it too aggressively to labs running lab developed tests. And so a little bit of a backdoor regulation, not excessive yet, but it's something to keep a watch on. We don't think that this has a huge effect on IVD, but the thing to remember about lab developed tests and in vitro diagnostics is that some part of this market, and we've gotten reports, we've done reports in the past, not our 18th edition, where we break out what portion that is, perhaps. Some portion of this IVD market is companies selling supplies to labs that they're going to use to make their own tests. So, because when they conduct an LTD, they're using an IVD of some form. Somebody's getting money for that. It's in this market. And that was something I always pointed out during the LTD debate, that some portion of that, it's not just labs, there are IVD companies that could perhaps suffer if there's a drastic change in laboratories deciding, say, not to do lab developed tests. What that portion is, I don't have, but you see companies like Thermo, a company like Kaigen, others, any company that has a mass spec system, they would be expecting to have that system used in a lot of LTDs. So while I don't see yet evidence that there's going to be a wave of lab developed tests competing with IVDs yet, because of the decision in particular, it's still kind of difficult to launch an LTD. I think that it does relieve some of that secondary market that we know is going on for IVD companies earning extra revenue selling for lab developed tests.
Awesome. All right, we've got a few more. What is the impact of the OBBA tariff and Rural Transformation Act on U.S. healthcare, rural closures, and Medicare medical coverage?
I think I'll start with the rural, and while I don't have a specific number, it's something that we're increasingly aware of in the U.S. healthcare system, that there are something like 80% of the counties in the U.S. do not completely have adequate healthcare for all the people that live in them. What's an example of that? There may not be a near enough hospital, or the physician, and those of us like myself, I mean, Kalorama's based in Arlington, Virginia, and I'm based in the New York area. We're used to a certain level of healthcare provision. You see a doctor, might be crowded, but you see a doctor when you need to. In some areas of the country, their doctor that they see may not have admitting privileges in any hospital. So that's a very different situation. How does diagnostics play in? Watch for this home collection, home sampling. I think it's going to be big. You're going to see a push for more and more tests. It's also because of the aging of the population. In Japan, this isn't something they talk about in theory, it's done. And for us during COVID, it was something that was done. And we're looking at, and you're already seeing, say, sexually transmitted diseases where this is being used more, or in elderly patients. And there's a lot more experimenting with it. So that's where I see the main impact of, but rural hospitals have been closing for some time, and that's always has an impact. If the Medicaid cuts in OBBA are continued, I mean, there are some hospitals in the country that get 60% of their revenue from Medicaid. And hospitals are the largest purchaser of in vitro diagnostics products, no matter how promising the physician office market is, no matter how promising the self-test might be. It's hospitals that buy most of the big instruments and the reagents. So anything that hurts them is going to hurt our business. We can look and see what Washington might do. There might be just because the Medicaid cuts were in OBBA does not mean someone could propose a bill. There already have been proposals to restore some Medicaid, so we'll see what happens there. But if there are cuts, I mean, that will have some negative effect on these on the market. We figure a lot into our projections. So the tariffs also came in. And while we didn't cling overly to tariffs in our market projections, especially because company guidance was generally that we're working through our supply chains and working this out. So that 5% CAGR has a lot in it, including some of the things that we just talked about.
Awesome. All right. We've got a few. These are good. And again, if we do not get to your question live on the webinar, we'll be sure to follow up with you individually. And I want to be cognizant, you got a couple more slides. So let's get a couple more in. China was listed in 2025 top growing categories, while it seems that everyone this year is struggling with shrinking market and decreasing prices in healthcare sector, including IVD. Could you please elaborate why China is on your growth list?
Yeah, very good. I mean, and the simple way to answer it is there is a lot of China. China was a market that we believe has not fully grown to its potentials, given the size of its population and its industrialization. It still does not have it never had the IVD market that one would expect for it. That growth number, even though it's the highest growth, and we don't get into specific numbers in our webinar, but we certainly do in the report, and there's more extended explanations of some of the thing you just asked about, is it might be highest, but that's partially because there aren't very many high growth countries at all. So there's still some China growth. We realize that the volume-based purchasing programs are having an impact. And so there was a time that China was double digits in growth, and I can say that is no longer the case. So we have moved it down, but show me the country where that would exceed it, and you have just a few growers out there, which is why increasingly IVD's shifting. This used to be a business where you made your extra money internationally, and every IVD company sold around the world. It's always been a global market. And that's still going to be true, but it's not as much as it used to be. For instance, developed countries will say grow at 5%. Developed countries will grow 4.8% on average. Emerging countries, 5%. That would have been a very different story in our report 7 or 10 years ago. So would have China. It'll be a much larger market. So there will be companies struggling in China. Another thing to remember is that with volume buying, someone will receive the bid. So and when you look at things from a market perspective, it'll lead to a lot of grumbling sales reps and distributors and companies and things like that. But someone is going to receive that bid. So the volume purchasing kind of cuts both ways when you look at it from an aggregate market.
Fantastic. All right, we'll do one more and then we'll let you finish your slides. Any thoughts on the mass spec launch from Roche? What is different from what TMO tried to do a few years ago?
It's hard to do the comparison with the TMO, but I would say that with Roche, they've got a cleared test now, and Roche can get away with some things that maybe other companies cannot. And it doesn't mean everything, but they are in so many labs and they have such a giant presence that this was something that they needed to add. And, they're in almost every market. So I think that to compete as increasingly when you're looking at a patient and saying, why doesn't this drug conjugate not work on this particular patient? Why are they resisting the payload? The existing tests aren't always enough in these cases. And so people are looking for, is there some other protein mechanism we can look at, and starting to use tools like this mass spec. So I think the answer that comes to me top of head is it is a different time than it was in terms of these tools, and people are taking a fresh look at it. They're also launching the sequencer. So I really think with Roche's strategy, a lot of what they do is they will be in every market that counts. And the mass spectrometry system is part of that.
Fantastic. All right. Again, we will get to the few that we did not get to today. So, Bruce, feel free to continue through.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. Yeah, I mean, one of the things we want to do, as I mentioned, Kalorama has a history, right? We've been covering in vitro diagnostics get back to that slide, for 2 decades. So we can do this. We can look at what's changed over time. And in 2000, 25% of this market was clinical chemistry. Now, in some emerging markets, it still is. It still is the forefront of a lot of IVD work, but now that's 8%, where molecular was 4%. And in 2000, in the 90s, molecular gets its start with HIV. It is still, a bulwark of infectious disease testing. It's now at 20%. I do also note, though, that immunoassays just seem to hang on at that same percentage of the pie. They're very useful. They're growing. Within that frozen 24% is a lot of innovation. You have some great point of care immunoassay tests, and molecular gets a lot of the focus, but we always want to talk about immunoassays. But it is interesting to see the trends over time. And then speaking of trends, I just wanted to go over, this is what to watch long term. And, do we have the answers today? No, but it's things that are on our radar. We're watching sepsis. Providers are not happy with CRP and lactates. They're using them. They're spending a lot of money. There's a lot of testing in that area, but they want new tools, and maybe not always rule in, rule out sepsis, but something that gives them guidance for the protocols. And you're seeing informatics and IntelliCept. We're just keep watching for adoption rates on those and other tests that perhaps provide a score or some indication of what to do with sepsis patients. Home sampling, we talked about a little earlier, but how much is it really going to be implemented? Is it going to compete with actual point of care tests? Watch for that. If I can get you a result, and if I can maybe pick up a lab sample from a patient's home and give them a call in a couple hours, does that compete significantly with a point of care where I get a result? Do I need a result in 15 minutes when I can get it in 3 days, 2 days, 1 day, an hour? How much do I have to bring that down for it to matter? So you're going to see home sampling perhaps be a major trend. Or it's going to be confined to a few areas. Some of it depends on the sampling technology. So watch for that, like who's winning that battle. IVD and life science fusion. Look at this. Now we went from life science instruments. We talked about mass spec before. We talked life science instruments entering IVD, to now the companies who were making those instruments like Bruker and now Waters you have Revity, you have Thermo, of course, already present in the market, to where the major IVD companies are going to be also life science. That could either be more of the same, it could be another kind of point, a talking point that of publicity that doesn't go anywhere, or you could really see tandem development of life science and clinical diagnostics much more. AI promise and proof, lots of usage in workflow, less in the actual diagnostics. But over a 5-year period, we have to suspect that there's going to be more of that. You're already seeing like some urinalysis usage of AI. Sepsis is a category. Oncology, we talked about like blocking payloads on various drugs, or maybe when you get to these critical questions, you can see the AI playing doctor more than you can on just a normal standard text test. But this is obviously a trend to watch. And if I'm doing this presentation in 5 years, it'll probably be a different thing we're talking about. Yeah, with that, I believe that's what we have. And again, we were just able to cut into a small slice of what the 18th edition has. If your organization doesn't have access to a copy yet through a subscription, it's available in various forms. And so contact one of our sales professionals in order to just talk about your needs. And we also have custom ability and things like that. So we can help you with your business planning. I think you might be muted.
I sure am. Thank you, Bruce.
Okay.
That concludes all the time we have today. Thank you, everyone who has joined us today. Thank you for your questions. As a reminder, we will be sending a follow-up email with the slides and how to access the webinar on demand. We'll follow up with you if we didn't get to your questions. And Bruce, great job. Thanks again for your time today, and look forward to the next one, hopefully.
My pleasure.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.